Hey everybody, I'm in Detroit. I was at the debate last night, and my first question is, did anybody give Bernie Sanders a hit of speed? Because that was about as animated as I've ever seen him at a televised debate. And I thought he comported himself very well. You would never have known that he was by far the oldest person on the debate stage. He's going to be 78 in September, and yet he seemed to have among the most adroit command of the facts. He had very sharp retorts when he was challenged by both the moderators and some of the other candidates. CNN, in its infinite objective wisdom, decided to structure the debate as a confrontation of sorts between, quote, moderates and, quote, progressives, which is obviously an oversimplification of the dynamics at play, but it resulted in Sanders taking a lot of incoming fire, and for the most part, he warded it off with aplomb, and he seemed to have a lot of support within the debate hall itself. And that's notable because the people who receive tickets to these debates tend to be party operatives, donors, people affiliated with the party apparatus in one way or another, and then there are others who get tickets from the debate from the candidates themselves. And the CNN handlers had warned the crowd not to boo, not to hiss, to be, quote, respectful to the candidates and let them finish their statements. And but for that injunction, I think John Delaney, who's this supremely irritating pipsqueak, would have gotten seriously booed. I mean, there were points at which you could palpably sense the disdain for Delaney among the people in the debate hall, which didn't manifest in outright boos, but kind of tempered hissing and consternation. And the fact that Delaney got so much time, or that he was the focal point of the debate, despite having a pittance in terms of his donor support. He has managed to get 1% in a few polls, which qualified him for the debate, but many fewer donors than Mike Gravel, who was prevented from participating despite meeting the key metric of 65,000 donors. But CNN chose to structure the debate around Delaney because he was elevated as a foil for Sanders. And there are legitimate debates and fissures going on right now within the Democratic Party, which you'd expect of somebody like Bernie now suddenly is one of the standard bearers of the party, having been basically exiled to the fringes 5 years ago. So that is a significant shift over time, and you would expect it to result in contentious internecine squabbling to some extent, but CNN really foisted that upon the debate in a kind of artificial way and chose to frame those disputes in a particularly disadvantageous manner for Bernie, but he actually capitalized on that and was able to put forward a performance that I thought was pretty impressive. One interesting note that you wouldn't have seen if you were home watching the debate was that Jeff Zucker, the president of CNN, sauntered out on stage prior to the debate beginning and said that the stakes have never been higher, and therefore CNN was deeply privileged to be hosting this exercise in democratic engagement. And I guess you could make an argument that the stakes have never been higher in U.S. history than currently in July of 2019, but I don't know. The Civil War had pretty high stakes, World War II, etc. However, creating the perception that the stakes have never been higher is very much commercially beneficial for CNN because it means that you have an extra incentive to tune into CNN day in and day out for updates on the American Republic supposedly teetering on the brink of destruction. And I thought it was interesting to watch this debate and observe that there were zero questions having specifically to do with the Russia investigation, with Mueller, with impeachment, etc., even though those subjects dominate CNN's daily programming on any given day. I mean, if you tune in at random to CNN, chances are high that there will be some Russia-related issue being reported on or analyzed or what have you. And that's been the case for the past 2.5 years, and perhaps even longer. So for CNN to devote so much of its daily energy to covering that range of issues and then not to formulate it into a debate question over the course of 2.5 hours, what does that tell you about the significance of that issue ultimately? It means that CNN has made some determination that it doesn't warrant a question on this high-profile stage, and yet it pollutes almost everything they do on a daily basis. I think that's sort of an interesting dynamic to observe. But from my standpoint, Bernie seems to be at his most natural and agile when he's lambasting the media for its perceived corruptions. And he lambasted it appropriately last night when he said that CNN takes huge amounts of money from rapacious corporations, pharmaceuticals in particular, which, I don't know, he seemed to suggest, I think with some justifiability, that funding source may have an impact on how debates over healthcare are framed by the CNN moderators. Now, it might not be conscious on their part in that they're taking direct orders from the pharmaceutical companies, which purchase ad time, but it's a more subtle and corrosive effect that you don't hear spelled out very often because politicians tend to be immersed in that same political media environment as their colleagues and peers in the major news organizations like CNN. So it doesn't even occur to them to point out that conflict. But Bernie's been pointing out that conflict for his entire career virtually. There are grainy public access television segments you can go and look up from the 80s when he was mayor of Burlington, when he discusses that issue at length. And so him pointing that out was almost his own version of shouting fake news. Now, obviously, he's not nihilistically deriding everything that the media puts out as fake, so it's a different twist than Trump. But it's a media critique that has been sorely lacking in the, quote, era of Trump, because Trump and Republicans have subsumed so much of the energy around media criticism for their own designs. And it's led to the media being fallaciously exalted as the guardians of democracy, in particular corporate media like CNN, the central figures of which posture as these like savior figures, and which is why Jim Acosta gets to preen as the last defender of the American Republic when he's in these kind of performative dance scenarios with Trump. But Bernie is taking back that critique and maybe formulating in a way that actually bears on the existing power structures that sort of govern how the media operates, or at least the corporate media who have been delegated with exclusive authority to oversee these debates by the party apparatus, namely the DNC. And I actually got a chance to talk to Marianne Williamson after the debate about Bernie's criticism of CNN, and she said, quote, "He's absolutely right. You know, until the 1980s, pharmaceutical companies could not advertise. You're not going to get an honest conversation. You know how many millions of dollars they spend on things like CNN? I mean, that's so obvious it should almost go without stating, but it needs to be stated because people aren't aware of it, even if they see the commercials and such in between news segments. It doesn't necessarily occur to them intuitively that could have an effect on the way that coverage is framed or the way that debate questions are posed. So that's my short takeaway. I actually wrote a piece for The Spectator that I will link to that discusses a little bit of this in greater detail. And we'll see what happens tonight. So I will talk to you later.